with this theme of World Values Day on values and volunteering, it's just such a fabulous opportunity, really, to look at the field. And I hope what I'm going to be able to do is to give you um, some context that can help you see, obviously, the close connections between values and volunteering, but also support you in being able to draw on your own experiences and insight as a volunteer or knowing volunteers in the work that you do to promote World Values Day and the cause of a world oriented more around ethical values. So I had got a slide to introduce myself. I'm going to do this very briefly because Charles has said too much. But at the moment, I am chair of a community housing project, which is volunteer led in South London. And we're London's largest 100% affordable community housing scheme, a community land trust. And you'll get those right across the world, India, certainly Canada, some amazing community land trusts as well. So global initiative. But now moving on, let's set volunteering in its true place. And its true place is that volunteering holds the world up. Now, the word volunteering isn't the word that everybody chooses to describe things. There can be many words for it: activism, parenting, being a good neighbor, lots of words for it. But it's essentially, working without pay for and in line with your values. And this is a model of the economy. So bear with me on this. There'll be no quiz at the end on this, but it's a model of the economy as a three-layer cake with icing. I love this model. It was developed by my friend, the late Hazel Henderson. Hazel was a leading environmental economist, born in Bristol in the UK, moved to the States, to Florida, and was an extraordinary writer. And the way Hazel describes the economy as a cake is that the top level of the cake, the icing layer, is the private sector. It's where money changes hands and all cash transactions within the market. And that's the level of icing. That layer rests on a public sector layer, which is schools and education and infrastructure and government, local government, national government. And the two of these parts of the economy, the private sector and the public sector, are measured and indexed by economists through their monetary value. And so the idea of gross national product, GNP, or GDP or GVA, there's lots of acronyms you can choose that measure that part of the economy. But that is still the icing and the top layer. And all of this rests on a non-monetary layer. All of this rests on a voluntary layer, which is around social connections, around family care, around community structures, unpaid work in the household, caring for people who are elderly or are kind of sick. That level of kind of a social cooperative economy, and that layer in turn resting on Mother Nature. So a very simple idea of just showing actually how essential volunteering is, that it's not an afterthought. Everything rests on volunteering. Now, the next slide looks at some research. Now, this is UK research. What I've seen of international research on volunteering bears this out as well. And this particular research draws on the work of Professor Johnston Birchall and Richard Simmons. And they look at why people volunteer, and they categorize these into individual incentives and collective incentives. Now, individual incentives are things like a chance to have my say, a chance to have a sense of achievement, social life, putting things right that went wrong for me. That's sometimes why people get involved in things as well. But those individual incentives, and then what Johnston describes as collective incentives, reflecting shared values and community benefit. People are volunteering in order to benefit the community or the public at large. And the fascinating thing about this research is that while many people start volunteering because of the individual incentives, the longer that people volunteer, the more that the collective incentives become the more important in describing people's motivations for volunteering. And what I love about that is that, the markets prompt us to be and act as consumers, looking for value for money, looking out for our own self-interests. And so the market grows consumers. And the more of our lives we live in that context, the more consumer-like we become or are encouraged to become. Volunteering grows our values and it grows us as citizens because it supports and encourages those behaviors that are pro-social in that sense. Now, the next slide is a little bit, it's going to be something that those who are steeped in the values work and practice and literature will know when, but it's a lovely just way of thinking about values. And it's helpful when you look at why people work, whether they're paid or they're unpaid. And it's a distinction between intrinsic values on the left-hand side and extrinsic values on the right-hand side. And intrinsic values are those values that we care about because they're good in themselves, in the way that Kant might have thought about it. These are just illustrations. Dignity, curiosity, beauty might be another one. Those are intrinsic values. Extrinsic values are values that involve our relationship with other people. And so social status, power, wealth, these are extrinsic values. I do always have to kind of remind us that, values are not just ethical values, that, people are always motivated by values. They just may not be particularly nice values. They may want to dominate others or, so on. So the interesting thing here is the extent to which volunteering supports intrinsic values. And there's a lot of work on the idea of employee engagement, which in some sense takes the notion of volunteering because it looks at what people are paid to do and then the extra mile that employees will go if they care about a firm. And again, while a lot of the framework of paid employment relate to extrinsic values, it's about pay policy or job title or status or the like. Actually, what really categorizes and accelerates people's engagement is where companies are able to align with their intrinsic values. And we'll come back to this in a minute. Next slide. And again, this is UK research, but please treat the UK as an illustration because, again, there's some consistency on this kind of data in the international research. The most consistent volunteers are people that are older, that have more time in their hands. They're the most consistent formal volunteers. And in the world of volunteering, people sometimes talk about formal volunteering, which is where you are doing something, maybe a role profile. It may be for a formal organization like a community group or a charity. And informal volunteering, helping your neighbor, helping somebody across the road. These kinds of ways are informal volunteering. And older people tend to be the most consistent formal volunteering. Now, that is in decline in the UK since the COVID pandemic. And that's because, for safeguarding reasons, that was a group that was encouraged to stay at home, and they never quite came back at the same level as others. So there is some concern around the level of volunteering. And so the World Values Day theme is an extraordinarily important theme in valuing volunteering. We do see a shift with younger people kind of inventing and reinventing volunteering in new ways. The idea of micro volunteering, small slithers of time to fit conveniently into people's lives, and informal volunteering, again, something of a surge amongst Gen Z and millennials. And then that point about diversity, which I do love, that volunteering is not something that is necessarily paternalistic, or that you're doing it for the good of others. Actually, people who have lived experience of being in need are also more likely to respond to the needs of others. Now, I talked about volunteering holding the world up, and the next slide just as an example of how volunteering can change the world. And this is a campaign which ran over 20 years ago. Now, Jubilee 2000 Coalition went international right around across the world. A petition that I helped to kick off ended up attracting something like 25 million signatures. And that was before digital, so it'll probably remain a Guinness World Record for that. But people coming together to challenge the world's leaders around the unpayable debts of the poorest countries. And in Uganda, for example, $1 billion of debt was cancelled, and the primary school enrollment rate was able to double over the following 5 years as a result of that debt cancellation. So, in so many ways, volunteering can change the world. Now, the next slide is about what's often called the voluntary sector. And the names for this will vary right across the world. I mean, there's no end to the creativity of humankind in terms of coming up with different names for the same thing. But non-profits, if you're in Francophone Canada, this would be the chantier economy or the social economy. The names all vary, but essentially, one term for it is the voluntary sector. And within the voluntary sector, there may be large organizations, there may be global organizations involving significant numbers of paid staff. But typically, they are still led by their boards of trustees or directors are volunteers. And so it still remains the voluntary sector in that sense. And it's a very powerful model of organizing where you have volunteers engaged in a cause or a purpose. I kind of call it the sort of northbound train, the effect that you get when everybody is pulling in the same direction. But the next slide is an important caveat, which is that volunteering can pull people together, but it can also pull people apart. And handling conflict and encouraging dialogue is an important skill if you work with volunteers or in the voluntary sector. We know that where there's conflict is not just about places on a map or an argument in the street. Conflict is rooted in people's values, and it's a clash of values that can lead to the most enduring conflict. So building peace, building dialogue needs to work at the level of values. And it's important to recognize within the kind of volunteer field that conflict is more common than you might think. The next slide is actually a case where I've been working in the context of conflict. It's an extraordinary story, which I'd be very brief to tell, but it is a football club, AFC Wimbledon in England. It's not just tennis in Wimbledon. There is a football club. And the story here was that the owner decided to sell and move the club to a different town, to Milton Keynes, and because he wanted to develop the ground for property. So he did that. Local fans got together and restarted the club. the Dons, and they started from the very bottom league and of amateur leagues and built their way up. It was a cooperative model, so members coming on board. And in the last couple of years, they've been able to actually return to Wimbledon and build this stadium with money from the volunteers, from their members, from their fans, £10 million to rebuild their stadium. So it's an extraordinary story. They're now in League One, so they're pretty high up within the kind of English scene. But they also suffered from some conflict in terms of governance and the board. So I was going in to do an independent review. And one of the themes that, agreed with them and with their members, something that everybody agreed on, which is that you can be voluntary, but not amateur, in the sense that actually, how do you run something with volunteers where you have an accountability for the quality and the standards and the impact and the outcomes that you look like? And it's something of a sweet spot to look at. Now, one of the most inspiring people that I've worked with in the field of volunteering, in the next slide, is my former colleague, Sally Bailey. Senior business leader, ran the retailer White Stuff here in the UK. Sally has disabilities, and she says that when she feels low, when she feels helpless, she helps somebody else. And that gives her power and that gives her agency. So, in her words, helping others helps me to feel better myself. And that's I think, a lovely kind of recognition of the value of volunteering in terms of a couple of ways, the next slide, in which people, in giving back, can also get back. And the first of these is about learning. And there's a really powerful and exciting innovation that's going on within the skills-based volunteering field of recognizing how powerful volunteering is for people in terms of learning. And these are what used to be discounted and set aside as soft skills, i.e., they don't really matter. It's only the hard skills that you need to worry about. And soft skills have been repackaged and rebranded and replaced in recent years as power skills. Skills like empathy, listening, collaboration. And, I love this phrase from my former colleague Hagit, who leads on learning at Pilot Light, talks about people learn best when they're motivated by a purpose and grounded by humility. And in a volunteering setting, that makes it a very open space for people to learn. The second way in which people get back as a volunteer from their work to give back, and it's the next slide, thank you, Charles, is around well-being. And the leading research centre in Europe, the Wellbeing Research Centre at the University of Oxford, completed an amazing piece of work, a macro review of research on all of the interventions carried out by companies or organizations to promote well-being amongst their staff. And the research covered over 230 organizations, around 50,000 employees. And the conclusions are remarkable, absolutely remarkable, that not a single measure to promote well-being, bring your pets to work, pool table, time management courses, not a single intervention run by business to promote well-being amongst their employees works, with one single exception, and that is volunteering, where companies support and enable their employees to volunteer. And Dr. Fleming, who led that research, suggests that it's likely to be because volunteering reflects a model of well-being that is more collective and more relational. So we're back to this sense that in a world obsessed by individual agency and individual rights, and because I'm worth it, that actually it's all the more important that values are recognized as the bedrock that they kind of are. So, just with that final slide, a sense that couldn't be a better time for the World Values Day. And volunteering is a beautiful way of practicing those values. How do we be our better selves? How do we bring our better selves into play? And the answer is if you were going to run a marathon, you wouldn't just turn up at the starting spot and head off and run. Or if you wanted to be a chess champion, you wouldn't just turn up at the contest with your chess pieces in a bag. You practice, you work hard, you get fit. And the same is true for our values, that we need to work our values in order to be our better selves. And that's one beauty of volunteering, is that it works directly on those values and it makes us fitter and it makes us better people as a result. So perfect timing, perfect theme.